Welcome back. In this episode, I want to delve a little bit deeper into DForce, not too deep, mind, but I wanted to show you how you can use the timeline features in Dash Studio to simulate a garment with DForce. And this is great for poses that do not transition from the A pose to the final pose quite that easily that standing poses usually do. So some examples include that if you have a hand or an arm that goes through the garment while the A pose shifts into the final pose, or you have something like a sitting down pose in which the character can't just go and plonk herself or himself down onto a seat, in which we may need to shift the position of the character so that the bottom really lands on the seat object so that DForce can drape the clothing appropriately. Let me show you what this looks like before we build this thing from scratch together. I'm using the texture shaded view here because I'm using a DForce garment that doesn't show up in the filament viewport. It's one of those things. So in this case, I'm going to have the character here transition from the standing pose into a sitting pose, and that happens with the timeline. So I'm doing it like this. I've already simulated the garment so we can see what this looks like as an end product. This is the final resting pose, and we can see that DForce has done a handy job making sure all the kinks in the clothing are properly folded and the cloth on these wide legs is kind of draped over the legs as well as over the seat object here. So this was not done with the default settings in DForce that I showed you in the previous episode. This is now done using the timeline. So I've essentially set up a couple of keyframes that let me describe to DForce what happens during that transition from one frame to another or from one pose to another. So this was the standing pose, and you can see that the character now goes and shifts back because that's what would happen in real life. Alternatively, you can also leave the character in that spot and just move the seat object. That is also possible. But if you're working with a set, then you might have difficulty doing that. So I'm basically treating the character as if she would sit down in real life. And then at the end here, we have some resting frames that you think, well, why are they important? It is so if you look closely at the garment, you'll see that it actually settles down. Nothing much happens anymore, but as we see after she's done sitting down, the cloth still settles down. And if you don't have that, it doesn't look quite as realistic. So give DForce some time here. Also, I've given DForce 90 frames instead of the default 30 frames. Let's see how that's done when we set this up from scratch. I'll start with a brand new scene and use exactly the same characters that I just showed you there. So the stylized 21 character, just for the sake of the fact that it is not the Genesis default character, it is a custom character. With hair, I'm using the Genesis 8.1 version for this. And once she loads in, I'm going to go and find that outfit that I put on there. This is a nice set that comes as part of the DForce Clothing Set 02 by 3D Universe. Same creator that made the custom Toon character that I'm using. And this here, that comes with several outfits. They're all DForce. There's a lot of shaders there. And this one here is the one we're using. It's kind of a jumpsuit thing with really wide legs. And I find it's a really nice demo garment for DForce and what DForce can do. The other candidate would have been a white dress, but I like these wide wafty trouser legs here, so let's use that. I'll put a link to this outfit in the description in that big PDF that you can download with this course. Just in case I can't find what that is. I think there was set 02 in there, so if I just look for that, there we go, there's this one here. That is, it's in wardrobe. I have the sleeveless jumper suit. I'll double click that and apply that to my character. And just so that I can just show you what happens if I switch this over to filament, it's completely transparent and almost invisible. So if this ever happens to you with clothing and you think, I'm sure I've loaded something on the figure, then it could just be the viewport draw mode. So if I switch that over to iRay, then I will definitely see it. But filament doesn't show it up for whatever reason. So if that happens to you, then just go and switch to a different viewport draw style. So in my case, I'm going to use the texture shaded view here so that it shows up. And just so that we can see it a little bit better, I'm going to go and apply a slightly different shader on this here, or a different material preset, namely this one here. There. So now we can see what's going on a little bit better. I'm also going to go and apply a pose to my character, and I've decided to use one from the Fresh Beauty poses here for Genesis 8. There's a couple here. I'm thinking this one here, base pose number 25, that's going to be nice. So if I double click that, this is the pose that I'd like to end up with. And we can see that we need to make some adjustments here. So on one hand, the legs kind of cross over one another. There's also the fact that her hand and her bottom isn't on the same height. So if I were to have a seat object here, then one of these needs to be adjusted so that they're on the same height. Otherwise, that's not going to look realistically believable. And then the other thing that I have to adjust is the hand that is currently going into the head here. So it's just something to be aware of when you dial in these one-click poses. It's rare that they fit exactly with the custom character that you're using. Often they're made for something like either the base figure or particular character, but if you use them with a different character, your character has different proportions, and hence the positions of the hands and feet, they might not quite match up as they should. So you need to be prepared to make some adjustments on that. I'm actually going to go and hit Ctrl-Z to bring the character back into the A pose, because I don't want to apply the pose on this particular frame. I want to think about this as an animation, and that requires me to open the timeline at the bottom here. We're not going to delve too much into animations. I don't want to overload you with details. There's a rather comprehensive video on my YouTube channel that I'll also link to in the document, in which I'm explaining more about getting started with animations and where the keyframes are found. And so we're not going to be dealing much with that. I just wanted to give you this really basic introduction of how you can use the timeline with dForce rather than explain how animations work from scratch, because that's a whole different topic. So essentially what the timeline does, and what any of these little triangles do at the bottom here, it means when you see something like that, that's where a group of keyframes is hiding on the timeline. And that means if I have some values here, and then slightly later I have different values here, then the timeline can interpolate between those values over time. That's literally all keyframes do. They interpolate over time. And we've already seen how this works on the Puppeteer tab, in which we interpolate values between 2 points as we move the slider along. And that is essentially also a form of animation, but it doesn't take time into consideration. So time isn't in existence there. Whereas the timeline is the same principle, but it takes time into consideration. So right now the timeline by default is set up to have 30 frames, and that usually happens over the course of 1 second. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that, and just think in frames for now. And frames being how long dForce has to calculate the garment drape, essentially. So with this being an animation, I would like my A pose to be on this keyframe here, on frame 0. And then if I move my playhead further, maybe to the end, then I'd like to have that pose on there that I dialed in, namely this one here. So if I double click that here on the last frame, then I can see that if I go and left click and drag my timeline, my figure interpolates between the A pose and then at the end of the timeline into the sitting pose, which is the final pose. And that's kind of neat. So remember that if you want to make adjustments, you've got to make them on the frame on which they need to happen, so not on frame 0. So in this case here, I'm on frame 30 already, and I will change that in a minute because I need a little bit more time. Just in, principle, if you make an adjustment now, this adjustment will be locked in on this frame, and that lets dForce interpolate between the real A pose on frame 0 and the last frame between we want to interpolate. So let's do that. On this frame, I'll go and zoom in, and perhaps I'll start with giving my lady a block to sit on, and then we'll deal with the hand and the crossed legs in a moment. So you could pick a prop. I'm going to make it super easy. I'm going to go and create myself a primitive here, which is going to be a cube, just with the default 1 meter size and the dimension of 1 meter in the world center with Y positive. And that's maybe a little bit large. So I'll go and scale that down so that we go and see kind of where she's sitting on. It doesn't have to be quite that thick, so I'll make that a bit slimmer here. And maybe even move that forward a bit so that we can see that dForce garment be interpolated with that in a moment. If I see her sitting here with the clothing on, it might be difficult for me to see where the body is actually in relation to the seat object. So I can go and make that sleeveless jumper suit invisible by just clicking that little eyeball icon here in the scene. That is how that would work. Or if I wanted to make all clothing items at the same time invisible, then my scene tools by 3D Universe comes in handy with this little icon here. That makes everything in the scene that is a clothing item invisible. So if I had multiple things like shoes, or maybe I had a jacket and some trousers, I can make them all invisible. So that makes it much easier for me to adjust the figure. We have several of these items here. This is for shoes, this is for accessories, this is for hair. So if I click that, then all the hair goes away. But the beauty of this is that this happens for all figures in the scene. So if you're working with multiple characters, then this is going to make your life a lot easier. I could also switch to base resolution, but I won't do that here. I'll just live on the edge a little. So I think my cube object needs to just be a little bit, needs to be a little bit slimmer still, like so. And the hand here, that is something I can probably, the easiest way to pose that is to just grab hold of it and move it so that I can use the inverse kinematic that we've learned so much about. Let's make that cube invisible so that it's easy for me to grab my hand, and I'll go and left click and drag it up like so. And then I'll bring my cube back so that we can see where the hand is in relation to the cube. And I can see I'm kind of there-ish. I think I want to leave it like that. I could just go left click and drag, try to put it back on the bottom. No, I think that was actually perfect. I'll leave it like that. I'll go and switch over to my power pose tool, figure out which hand this is here. And let's say this is the right hand. I'm going to try and rotate the hand like so. And that's not quite enough to make the pose look believable. So I'll go and take a look at every single finger here, namely this part of the finger here, and just move all these fingers down so that they touch almost onto the seat object here with those things. So not these, those are the groups that will curl up the finger. So I'm going to use these things just so that it looks like she is balancing herself on the seat object. And all that happens on the last frame of the animation. Just remember that. There. I could probably spread them out a little bit better, like especially the middle finger like so. There, that kind of looks natural, doesn't it? Okay, perfect. So that's one thing sorted. The next thing that we need to sort is the leg. So I think I'm going to leave her left leg, which like our right leg essentially. So her left leg, I'll leave that in place and just move this leg over to the other side a little bit, just like that. And it's kind of a nice example that I'm using all kinds of posing tools here. So anything that'll help you on this journey is good. You can use Power Pose, you can use the manipulator, you can use the posing tool here, you can use the values on the parameters tab. Just mix and match and see whichever feels right for the current task. I think I'm good here. The only other thing that I'd like to fix now, and we might as well switch the hair back on because it will be in relation to the hair now, is the hand here on the head. So I'm thinking that the most logical way for us to look at this is probably this arm here. So if you click on this, you can try to adjust that. I'm just going to go and try that with these posing tools here. Yeah, that kind of works. It's actually not the arm, it's not the shoulder, I was going to say, it's actually the collarbone I think that I've got selected, which is why this works. So that was by total fluke, so it actually does work. If you find you're on the wrong bone and you can't quite adjust something like this as far enough as you want it to, then it's very likely that you're on the wrong bone. So once again, if we look at the power pose hierarchy here, I believe sadly there's no scene to blue dots translation. It only works the other way around. I believe I was on this joint, which is the correct one. But if you look at it logically, you might have thought, hey, maybe it's a shoulder. So if you go onto the shoulder, you might find that the adjustment isn't going as far as you wanted it to. See that? If you go onto the very limits here, then don't make the mistake to go and undo the limits, because that'll twist this joint more than it should. So in that case, go one joint further up the hierarchy and try to bend that, and that'll probably yield more success. So I think I'm kind of happy here. Let me go bring back the outfit just with this button here, or just with the little eyeball icon in the scene tab here. We got the outfit. It doesn't look great right now, but D-Force should take care of that. So let's see how that might work. First of all, I'm going to go and test that animation again. If I go and left click and drag my playhead, that's now on frame 30. If I go and left click that over to the other side, then I will see that the starting pose isn't actually where it needs to be. It is in the center of the scene, and this is not how my character should sit down. See that? She moves her legs forward, and that's going to confuse DForce. What we need to do is literally think about this like a real-world scene. So she needs to be in front of my seat object, and then she needs to move backwards and then sit herself down. Only then will DForce have a chance to simulate the cloth as it does in the real world. So alternatively, we can also move the seat object into place. That is also a possibility. We can animate either object. But I think for us, the easiest way to do this is to just go and move to the first frame, so frame 0, then select our character here and just move her forward, like so. Actually, before we do this, I find it very helpful to set keyframes on the positions that Dash Studio may not have auto keyframed by itself. So the way this works under the hood is that whenever you change a value like translation, rotation, morph slider, and so forth, Dash Studio will recognize this and say, hey, there's no keyframe in this position, so I'm going to make one now that you're making a change. It's a behavior that can't be switched off as far as I know. Even though it would be helpful to be able to do that, it can't be done. So as a result, if you haven't set a keyframe, then not all parameters for that particular position are locked in. So case in point, at the end of my timeline here, I see these triangles, but that is only for the values that Dash Studio has changed. So my Z translational value, the blue axis, has not been changed. So I need to go and keyframe that in. So click that little plus icon here that says create key, and that will now create a keyframe for anything and everything that is inside the selected object, which is in our case, the stylized 2021 character. So if I now go and left click and drag my playhead back to the first frame, or frame 0, I can go and just move that character forward like so, and then set another keyframe here so that these changes, including the Z translational value, is going to be locked in. If I do that here, this one here, create key, plonk, then I should see that my character is still interpolating, but now also shifting positions. You see that? She was standing inside the cube before, now she's standing in front of it, and as I move into the sitting position, she's now moving backwards. Like this is essentially what's happening here. And this is what we need to do. So to reiterate then, just so that we remember, if you wanted to set this up, make sure that on the A pose here on frame 0, you set a keyframe, then you move to the last frame of the timeline, then you dial in your pose, make all the adjustments that you want, and then you set another keyframe. Then you see, is this motion correct? And if not, go and make a change to that. But make sure you don't set any additional keyframes in there unless you have to. So if I were to see, for example, that like halfway through, like on frame 15, there's something in which her hand goes through an item of clothing, then this is my chance now to move that arm out of the way so that it doesn't interfere with the DForce animation and hence causing explosions. So thankfully I don't have that, but if I had that, then I could literally just go and take whatever arm or limb or whatever is necessary and just move that out of the way. And as a result, Dash Studio will interpolate from here to this position and then from here to the last position, thereby avoiding any DForce issues. That's kind of the plan here. But I don't want to make it too in-depth. I just want to make sure that you understand the concept and then play around with this in your own time. Now I need to make another change. Before I run the simulation, it's a good idea to save your scene. So I'm going to go and do that. The whole scene, I'm going to call it DForce Sitting Demo. And I've done that on my previous scene as well. This was the one that I've shown you in the beginning. I thought I'd save that as well, being on the safe side and all. So now I need to go over to the simulation settings tab and tell DForce that I want to use my timeline for this. Let's go and do that. Under here, under simulation, there is the duration tab here. And that now under frames to simulate is currently set to current frame. And that means DForce will do this in play. So it will essentially interpolate to the pose like I've shown you in the previous episode for standing poses, and that works really well. But if I go and change this over from current frame to animated use timeline play range, then it'll acknowledge whatever is happening in the timeline. There's a third option here, animated custom. That is similar to the current frame setting here, but it gives you the option to specify more frames in which the simulation can happen, but you still won't be able to control it. Whereas when we use this here, use timeline, then no matter how many values I set on my timeline, like duration and keyframes and all that, DForce will take that into account. So that's what we're going to use. And before we hit simulate, and while we're talking about settings, just so that you've heard of it, there's something here under collision that lets me set the quality of how much time DForce can spend on simulating the garment. That is currently set to better, which is the middle option here, better continuous. There's also best, that'll take a little bit longer, and there's also good, which takes a little bit less time, just so that you know there are options for you to, play around with if you wanted to do that. I'm going to leave it on the middle option here, and that is all I'll do, and I'll hit simulate and see what DForce makes of it. Now notice my timeline is still on the default range of 30 frames. So I'm thinking that's probably not going to be enough, and we're going to go and change that up. I just wanted to lock in how the principle works, and then we can make adjustments and reiterate over that. There we go. It's looking good. It's looking good. 30 odd seconds later, we're where we want to be. And DForce has done an adequate job. It has worked with 30 frames. The hand pose is debatable. We can adjust that. But we can also probably make that a little bit better. So I find that even though the garment has draped and it looks much, much better than it did before, I think if we give DForce a little bit more time to simulate this, it'll have a chance to let the cloth just settle down a little bit towards the end. And it's just basically, what we've seen there in the beginning when I've shown you what happens over the last 30 frames, where the cloth was just wafting kind of, not so much in the wind, but it's just kind of, settling down. It is a physics simulation after all. So that can be done by just giving DForce more time. Like we said before, if you wanted to just simulate this for a standing pose and you wanted to give it more time, under duration here, if you'd use the animated custom, you could set something up that is more than 30 frames. So the first option here, this one, current frame, that'll just use 30 frames no matter what. But if you use this one, you could give it more frames. That's for standing poses. If we wanted to use the timeline, then we need to do this manually. So I'm going to go keep setting this to use timeline play range and go and set these values on the timeline. So I'm thinking that for the whole simulation of her sitting down and transitioning from the A pose to the sitting pose, I'm going to go and give it 60 frames. And then once she's sat down, I'll give DForce an additional 30 frames so that it can just go and let the cloth drape and settle down a little bit. So we're saying 90 frames in total, and I can set that at the bottom left here where it says total. Currently it says 31, which is essentially 30 frames plus frame 0. That is, one of my viewers has brought that to my attention. I never knew why it was an extra 1 there. So maybe I'll stick with that and say 90 plus 1. That's basically 90 frames plus frame 0, and I'll make that 91. That's the total duration of my animation, and you can see that the timeline layout has changed here a little bit. I'll go and park my playhead on the first keyframe here, and I'll go and close this down. And I can see that on frame 30 here, I see these triangles. And that means underneath here, if I'd go and expand this out, I would see real keyframes. But so the triangle essentially denotes a group of keyframes underneath here, somewhere on this track. So if I wanted to go and move this over to frame 60 here, then I could literally left click and drag every single keyframe and move them over. But because this is a group, I need to do this slightly differently. I need to go and left click and drag a little rectangle around this and go and right click on it so that I can go and copy the selected keys here. And that means DAZ Studio has made a copy of whatever was here. Now I can go take my playhead, left click and drag that over to frame 60, which is where I'd like to paste a copy of these over here. So I'll just go right click over here and say paste keys. And now I can see there's a little triangle that's appeared here, which is now pasted in what I've just copied over from frame 30. So I don't really want this keyframe to be on frame 30 anymore. So since they are still selected here, I can just go and right click on it and say delete selected keys. See where we're going with this? We're now going and interpolating between, and this is on my character here, we're now interpolating between the A pose on frame 0 and the sitting down pose on frame 60 over here. The cube also has a keyframe. We don't really need that because the cube doesn't move. So I'm just going to go on left click and drag a little rectangle around it and just delete that so that the cube is not moving at all, because we're happy for it to be in the position that he's currently in. And now if I go and left click and drag, I can see that my character in fact interpolates between frame 0 and frame 60. I can also see that the clothing is kind of going a little bit wrong here, but that's okay. We're going to re-simulate that. In fact, if you don't want to see that, you can just go and clear out all the results on the simulation tab. So she's now going to interpolate sitting down from A to her sitting pose between 0 and 60. And then from frame 60 to frame 90, nothing appears to happen. But this is essentially just time for D-Force to let the cloth settle. So this is going to take 3 times longer to simulate, but it's going to be worth it. Let's check it out. Hit that big blue simulate button and see what happens. Here we go. This took close to 2 minutes, so much longer than the first run, but the result is also much better. If I go and look at this more close up, I can see that the cloth is draped much more naturally and much nicer than before. See that? So D-Force, if you give D-Force more time, it can really do some stunning results. I really like that, including that little kink over here that would happen in real life as well. It would just go and kink on the seat object here. Don't know how easy it is to see on the video, but yeah, I'm really happy with this. So there we go. And you'd think that while we were watching this simulate, nothing much happened over the last 30 frames here between frame 60 and frame 90. But if I go and move my playhead, you can see that there's quite a lot that's happened. So look at that. This is what's happened. And if you let it simulate even longer, then D-Force would just keep going and moving the cloth until it's completely settled down. But this is why with just 30 frames, D-Force just didn't have enough time to do a really accurate calculation on this whole thing. So, you know, give D-Force more time, either with the standing position or with the timeline principle that I've shown you here. And you're going to have some great results with D-Force, and a little bit of patience as well. You're going to be willing to experiment and see what happens there with different techniques. So I hope I could show you the ropes of delving deeper into D-Force here, both with the quality and the animation settings here. Just one last thing before we go, and that is, how do you know if an object has D-Force on it, an item of clothing? I mean, sometimes it says it in the name, but how do we know? I mean, is there a way to check this? Because the simulation tab will let you simulate something no matter if it has D-Force or not. I mean, if you don't have any objects that have D-Force in your scene, then it'll just come up with an error message and just says, well, we don't have anything I can't simulate. But there might be something, and you might be wondering where that is. And just to let you know that, it is on the Surfaces tab. So if I go and select maybe my character, let's do that, and I head over to the Surfaces tab here, and I'll go and open her up. This is the character here under Surfaces. I can see all the bits and pieces that she has, and I'll just look at the arms here perhaps. If I open that up, I can see all the channels that make her up, but it kind of ends here on geometry. So that's the last entry that I have here. So there's the volume, there's emission, and then there's geometry. And then the next surface starts. So there's nothing else on the arms that describes anything else. So we have, those are just the regular iRay surface properties. So if an object does have D-Force properties, then there'll be an additional channel underneath here that's called simulation. So if I go and close her down again and just open up the outfit she's wearing, and I'll just go to one of these, maybe fabric here, you can see that we have emission, we have geometry, and we have simulation. So that's a good way to tell if you see all these things defined here. So if you open that up, you can essentially change the surface properties of the clothing item. So you can define how much it buckles and how much it collides with itself and how much wind resistance it has. And so essentially things like a piece of satin would react very differently to draping than denim or heavy cloth would. So this is where all that stuff's defined, in case you're wondering. And there's also a good place to check. If you don't see this, then the item of clothing doesn't have D-Force properties. That's how that works. In the remaining parts of this series, we're going to talk more about accessories as well as hair and get you familiar with those. And then we're going to go and move on to adjusting clothing items with other options other than D-Force, including external tools like Hexagon, ZBrush, Blender, and even Marvelous Designer, another very exciting cloth draping engine. Stay tuned for that.